Hello and welcome to the Color Mentor podcast. My name is Paul Hanrahan. I'm a colorist, originally from South Africa. Now I'm based in Taiwan. On this podcast, I'm going to be talking to people who have mentored and inspired me on my color grading journey over the years. So welcome to the show. If you'd like to learn more about color grading, you can head over to my Patreon. It's called Color Mentor at patreon.com, and it includes test footage, color charts, basic skill training, all the way up to full coursework on various topics. I also offer one-on-one mentoring for those who want to refine their craft further. But without further ado, let's get on with the show. In this episode, I'll be talking to Thatcher Freeman. He's a California-based colorist and software engineer, and for his day job, he's an actual AI specialist. He's made great contributions to the color grading and software coding communities. He's also a filmmaker. So I wanted to talk to him to find out what makes him tick. Cool. Hey, Thatcher, great to see you finally in person, to see your face.
Yeah, you as well, dude.
Yeah, we've chatted a fair amount online. That's how it is now. Everyone's chatting on forums. The world of Discord. I'm just really impressed with how involved you are in online forums, and the quality of your output is very, very high. So I really wanted to chat to you, find out what makes you tick, and find out why such a technically skilled person is interested in the film industry. So yeah, welcome to the Color Mentor podcast. And just for context, people maybe don't know you. Could you just give a little bit of background as like where you've come from, what's your connection to film, and kind of where you see yourself heading?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of dived into video because like I was in college for a while and I was like making short films just every year I'd make about one short film, and each year I was trying to learn like another aspect of it, like, from the editing to like shooting better and lighting better and so on. And eventually I got to sort of the tail end of the post-production pipeline, and it was like color grading, right? And I was shooting on a Zcam E2 at the time, which, it has horrible color management. It's incompatible with everything, right? But they had like their own ACES transform that had like a 1D LUT and whatnot going on in it. And I was like, this is like unviable. Like, how am I going to composite things into it if the LUT only goes to linear and not back to log and these sorts of problems, right? So ultimately, I kind of like started picking up coding DCTLs and looking into like color space transforms. And I kind of started off by basically in college, I studied machine learning. So I was like kind of into this like data science, like regression sort of stuff, right? So I was like looking at this LUT and I'm like, I have the chops to like figure out what function, was used to produce this LUT, right? Or at least find an equivalent function to it. So I like made this better version of their ACES IDT, and I also made an ODT that inverted it. And and then after that, I was kind of just getting into like sort of like camera regression, like camera fitting, and I would like shoot exposure brackets and try to, figure out the log curve that way rather than relying on the LUT that they provided and whatnot. And that kind of just like started the whole rabbit hole, just like reading more and more, text and whatnot. And I've still been doing my like one short film a year. And I started branching out, and I started building this like larger library of DCTLs, where it's just every time I needed some kind of operation in Resolve, I would figure out how to code it up, and I just post it online like publicly.
Right. And so you actually your interest extends to as far back as like the script writing, the shooting, all of that kind of. Okay, great. That's amazing.
I do the whole thing except for the acting, I suppose.
Right.
I also have someone else hold the boom pole because it's hard to do that while you're shooting. So
skills, man, mad skills.
But yeah, I don't have that skill yet. So, but yeah, so I was like making all these different DCTLs, and like one thing that kind of occurred to me when I was trying to like learn color at the time was that like everyone online like had their LUT, they had like, some pipeline that they wouldn't really show you, or they would have like a video that's kind of just got a series of like tricks that you could learn from like a Photoshop tutorial. Like it wouldn't be like good tricks, and I always felt like so unsatisfied, and it took me so much reading. Like, it took me a lot of like watching YouTube, a lot of like reading books and online forum posts and whatnot in order to try to get my bearings with this color science stuff. And ultimately, I was like, if someone had just like posted the relevant code online, I would actually have a chance of like having learned it faster. And
Yeah,
there are a few people out there who are posting like open source code, and I 100% like commend that. But there aren't enough people who are doing it. So I was like, maybe if I just do it, I don't really need to earn any money from it, right? But
right.
but I wanted to like do that so that we could like maybe further the progress of
Yeah,
that kind
you wouldn't be,
of these
everyone wouldn't
tools,
be
right?
hitting their head on what feels like a really stupid problem.
Yeah, like everyone
Yeah,
spends all their time looking for context, right? Rather than like pioneering and innovating upon the tools. Whereas
yeah.
like, because I like studied machine learning in that space, up until like, very recently, everything was super open. Like starting in like 2012, everyone would make something state of the art and then they'd just give you the code and they'd write a paper about how it works and whatnot. And
Yeah.
you just like read a bunch of papers. Like you could read like 5 papers and now you're like caught up with what the state of the art is
Yeah,
and
in
you're
the
ready to move
academic
something.
realm, the
Yeah.
development, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I
Amazing.
thought that was like so empowering, right? And then in color, we do the opposite. Everyone's just like keeps all their secrets to themselves and they allude to things, but they don't tell you how it works. Or sometimes they don't even know how it works, to be honest. It's like they've learned these tricks that kind of work in a backwards way, right?
Yeah. Well,
And
I mean,
yeah,
I think it's the trajectory that we're in. We're not in a unique slice of time. Yesterday led us today, which is leading to tomorrow. I mean, we came from an industry that was $1 million suite for a coloring, $1 just for the
yeah,
hardware of a coloring suite. You had very little chance of becoming a colorist unless you were, and literally the number of colorists now have got two extra zeros. One
yeah,
has now become 100. So yeah, we're in that slide of everything opening up, everything becoming more accessible, like all these online forums, you know,
yeah. And
community
I
efforts
think,
like ACEs were never around in the past. So yeah, but yeah,
yeah.
this is people's livelihood. So obviously they do hold it close to their chest.
Yeah, but also machine learning is other people's livelihoods. And
It's
like
great.
they
It's
kind of
great
they kind of just
info.
share it. They're like excited to just like drop some papers, and just give that out, right?
But my
So
my my first exposure to this kind of thing, I think it was a Facebook group of GANs, like
yeah,
image generating GANs, and it was
yeah,
all like like whenever it was anything to do with a person, it was just kind of this meat puppet that had been
yeah,
sculpted together. I got that was that's and then that rapidly moved into
yeah. Look at how much that has progressed.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Especially like like Stable Diffusion came out, and now everyone's got an image generator of their own, right? Like
yeah.
it's great, kind of, you know.
It- Very easy to make, very just somehow lifeless looking pictures.
Yeah, I mean, I won't
there's
discount that to be that is true,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. But I
Yeah,
think because it's an art as well, just like picking up a camera and shooting an amazing image, it's an art. The
yeah, for
prompting,
sure.
it's well, okay. I've recently been putting together a little treatment, and I've been bouncing between Leonardo AI to just knock up
Hmm.
some images, and then I jump over to Google and I do similar searches. So I'm having this left-right comparison between what it feels like to prompt the current level AI image generators and what it feels like to do a Google search. And you start taking the way you treat the two tools as the same. Like this, a Google search is literally is looking through the list, where the AI search has been it's been into a blender, it's been pulled apart into its pieces, but it's still the Google search in a very
It feels
complex way.
similar, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, but it's like this mashup, right?
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like in the case of like colorists, right? Like a lot of colorists view themselves as like my value comes from my intellectual property. Being like, here's the sequence of tools that I figured out are the best
Uh-huh.
tools. Here's my LUT. Here's the
Yeah,
secret tool that no one else has. Here's this little technique that only I know, like stuff like that, right? But I think in reality, the value of the colorist is in their superior taste to us mere mortals. You know,
yeah.
like like
I
that
mean,
should be like where
I
the
would
value
dig
comes
even
from, I
lower. I
think.
would dig even lower to in my experience in the actual color suite in the hot chair of
Yeah,
okay, you've got 3 hours and you have to finish this thing is more, can you sit there and sit
Yeah.
down,
Do you
work
have the
hard,
speed and the
finish the thing,
consistency?
and
Yeah.
just with non-ideal situations, can you just get it right? Can you just squish and squash it? Can you literally manipulate? And
Yeah.
sometimes brute force manipulate the things to look like, okay, now it matches and it flows and everyone's okay with it. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's it's a wide range of skills. I mean, one of the things I really wanted to, because I think you really embody this from your opening statements about your interest in film and obviously your background in coding, is this tech versus artistry. No, so, I mean, an opening question for you. Do you feel like they're two separate realms and you have to jump into one and jump back to other? Or do you feel like that there's overlap between what we would consider technical engineering physics and art, color, just the arts? How do you feel about that?
It's interesting because I think like a good artist could probably make good art using any set of horrible tools, you know?
Right.
Like
I totally buy that. Use
yeah,
what you have. Yeah.
yeah, you wouldn't let your tools slow you down. I mean, like they would slow you down, but you wouldn't let it stop you, right?
Yeah.
So, but I do think like better tools obviously allows for like more efficient work. It allows for like better workflows, reduced odds of breakage. Like ideally in an ideal world, if you have like the right tools, you're going to be like grading and nothing ever breaks, and then you're never sitting around saying like, ah, shoot, these cyans or whatever are absolutely nuked, right?
Yeah.
Like I have to fix those, right? Because that's a waste of time, and that's like a pitfall of the tool. Ideally, you don't want to have to do that.
But it's comfort zone. You just, I'm in my comfort zone. I'll just do that
Yeah,
same old thing
yeah,
again and
like
again. But
like
there's
I
job
want to
pressure.
like
There's
yeah, I want to enable the artist and make it so that they can do really good work really easily, right? Because that will only make the grades better, you know?
right.
Like oftentimes like it's actually not uncommon that you watch like a Hollywood movie and the grades are like, there's certain parts where you're like, did they like run out of time, or is their pipeline broken or something? Like, there's like some color in the background and you're like, I don't know if that like works just right?
Well,
And
I can guarantee you there wasn't as much time as the colorist wanted on every job
yeah,
that you watched. Guaranteed.
they say
Not
the
as
same
much
with
time as they
the
wanted.
VFX work too, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, so so yeah, like technical versus like artistry. I honestly like knowing the technique, or like if you want to be like a good colorist, the key is to have the good taste, right? It's so like the art is really definitely like the bigger factor, but I
Mm-hmm.
suspect I believe that if you are technically proficient as well, then that informs how you conduct your art, and that allows you to get to the right result a little faster. At least
Yeah.
that's what I would hope for anyone. It,
Not
it works
operate.
for yeah, it works for me at least.
Yeah. Not
So
operating blindly. Yeah. Yeah. Art with insight. Yeah.
yeah,
with behind the scenes info.
yeah,
Yeah.
it
I
turns
mean,
into an educated guess instead of just a blind one. So
totally. Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, the because another we just talk about the way the industry's developed. 20 years back, it used to be you were employed by a facility, and there was 80% of people employed, 20% of people were freelancers. Now that's really flipped on its head.
hmm
Everyone's freelance, and now colorists are in the situation where they have to be their own color scientist. They have to be their own producer. So, I mean, ideally at the top end, there's a color scientist who handles the color science, it's an image scientist, and there's the colorist who does the people interface, the
yeah,
knocking it together on the day. But people are now trying to do that whole thing. I mean,
yeah. If you're doing the full stack, like then suddenly you have to learn like all the different aspects at least as well as you can. And sometimes I feel like there aren't that many great resources for it. Like it's hard to know which resources are telling the truth and which ones are kind of giving you garbage information, right?
yeah,
So,
I mean, it's a theme that we can talk about, but I feel that almost like the a layperson who just comes to a white paper or something like that, you read it and you think this is the truth, this is it. But on closer inspection and with more experience, you realize that all of color theory, like everything that we do, LUTs in general, they are assumptions. They are kind
hmm
of broad rules which get us close to emulating, to doing something satisfactory for the human visual system. But even the definition of what the human visual system is still Yeah, a bit gray, and we start going into what's happening in the brain, and is it feedback or feed forward? Is the brain telling the eyes what
Yeah.
to see, or the eyes? Is it? Are we cameras or projectors? Uh, you know,
Yeah.
um, you realize that the whole thing is fairly shaky. So, at some point it doesn't become viable to take all that, what becomes almost like a psychological breakdown, a nervous
Yeah.
breakdown of like, I can't actually rely on any of this theory because it's all just assumptions. And half of the experts disagree, half the experts agree. But yeah, I mean, I think it speaks back to colorists need technical people like you to bridge some of those gaps, find good assumptions, find good maths. But okay, just get back to the real world now. Where do you see yourself in 5 or 10 years? What's your ideal job?
Ideal job. I mean, if I had to pick a job that was in the film industry, so basically,
Right, right. On the film side, yes.
assuming that it paid enough,
Yeah,
Um, I mean, some people have like pitched to me this idea of like, oh, I should start like a Patreon or like some kind of like subscription thing in which I dump out like novel tools for, the benefit of color as a whole, right?
right.
And that's it's not a bad idea, to be honest, right? Like, uh, there's a question for me of like how many people would contribute to such a thing,
Yeah,
you know? Um, so that would definitely be like one approach to it would be to kind of like almost do what you're doing, where it's like you kind of like build this like online presence in a way, right?
yeah,
And that's kind of the thing you monetize. The other approach, and this is something I've also been diving into, is like having like a few like clients who regularly pay you to like do DCTL development or like OFX development, and I'm just like contracted under them, like and paid hourly or whatever, right?
yeah.
To code stuff up. And that that has its values too, but typically such clients are not so willing to share the code with the world,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know.
sure. It's
Yeah.
for them, and
Yeah, yeah.
presumably
I will
they
say,
pay accordingly.
yeah, I will say that I do offer a discount for like open source coding, but none of them have taken me up on that yet, so we'll see.
Yeah,
But yeah, yeah. So like, I guess logically I'd be going down at least one of those two paths. I think, like in terms of like my current trajectory. Sometimes like, there's always the possibility of like, if some post house wanted to reach out to me and ask me if I want to be like their color scientist and write tools for them or whatever. But um, I don't know if it's like some closed source thing where then I have to go on podcasts and like keep everything hidden. It kind of defeats the mission,
right, right.
So,
The
yeah,
scope would get limited. Yeah, I agree
yeah,
with you. I mean, just from my far, my distant vantage point of kind of how you interact with the community, that seems to be some logical, step as to like either a hardware or software development tool, a company who developing the tools could benefit hugely from a person like yourself, or on the creative end, designing pipelines, writing specific, interesting color manipulations for specific projects. I could see that working well. So anyone listening,
yeah. Well, I don't know. I'm
hit
not
up
here to like,
Thatcher. Yeah,
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 to ask for work or whatever. I'm actually pretty swamped these days.
yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, like I would want to like kind of work on like one of those ends probably, Um, I do have clients now. It's just like I kind of wish to like go more on like the open source side of things, where it's
Right.
like there's like an appeal to the Patreon side where it's like, oh, it's sustainable and then I can like code things and like spend more time looking at it rather than just like my time after work, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny situation we're in with all social media where we demand it for free, or it's for free, but we pay on the back end with data scraping and privacy
Yeah,
and
and ads.
and
Yeah.
ads and all those kind of things. But yeah, yeah, it's what I did want to get it to. I mean, I see that on forums people often asking you technical advice. And they need that solution of like they need the maths or the physics behind it, and you can really fill that in. I mean, just almost like a how-to or like an insight for someone who does it regularly. from a stated problem to back propagate into the maths and the code and all that. Do you find that a very easy process? So some creative requirement to back propagate into the details and how to reverse engineer it. Do you find that quite easy, or is that a struggle?
Well, I mean, sometimes like people ask an interesting question, right? Like for example, here's one that I've answered in a couple places that's kind of fun. Is the one where like whenever like Cinedy or one of these websites does a dynamic range test, like
Yeah,
people are like, "Oh, but if the raw is 12-bit raw or if the sensor readout is 12-bit, like it can't have any more than 12 stops of dynamic range, right?" Like that's the
right.
claim that you hear. And then you kind of like what you want to do is you want to look into it and you say like, first off, is the claim true? And then you try to like understand every aspect of that. So, if you have like 1 pixel, right? Like obviously it can only be, between like 0 and 4095 if it's 12-bit, right? And
Right.
that's going to be, 4095 to 1 ratio. That's okay. That's 12 stops, right? About.
Mm-hmm.
And then you might conclude like, okay, case closed in linear. That's the deal. But then you also look at like, well, Arri raw is like a log encoding and it's 12 bits, right? And it clearly has more than 12 stops of dynamic range. So then you have to understand like, okay, so log encoding will differ in terms of the dynamic range there, for example, right? And then you also think like, well, why is it that when I downsample the image to much smaller, it's like it's like you can almost have like more dynamic range, right? It's because like you're like kind of averaging several values within a region and you effectively get like a higher bit depth, perhaps. That might be one way to view it. Or maybe the other way you view it is like, oh, if you have several pixels, like if you have a region and it's all like a 12-bit image, maybe you
Yeah.
view it as like, well, what's the signal to noise ratio in that area? Like, because I can generate 1-bit images where you can see more than, pure black and pure white just because on average, a region will be like zero point 0.5 or 0.25 or something, right? Like that can be done. So,
From what I'm getting from it's like, what's the really, like, what's the useful part of the technology? Like, sure, we've got all that range, but like we fuss over highlight dynamic range, but how many
yeah,
pixels are
so
actually sitting up there? Oh, very few. How
that's
much?
true. I mean, like ultimately, you're just gonna roll it off at the end, and it gives a much
Yeah,
better looking roll off than if you
yeah,
had just like clipped them.
yeah,
But yeah, so like first you have to understand the issue in as many ways as possible. And to be honest, when someone asks a question about that, I don't necessarily know the answer offhand, right?
yeah,
But it's like so it's like I'll pull up Fusion, I'll run some tests myself, and see what's going on, and I try to think about it like mathematically, and then it comes down to just writing a kind of response that hopefully people can understand. And I don't know,
yeah.
like I write it in the way that I wish someone would explain it to me, I suppose,
Right.
and that there's not much better you can do than that, right?
Yeah. Well, just
Yeah,
share with people what made the idea click for you, and
yeah.
what you've earned, what you've gleaned, and your insights from having this problem rolling around in your brain.
And the
Yeah.
truth is, like, yeah, sometimes I write it just so that, like, later I can, like, search up the post and double check what I did. So it has to be, like, reference for me, too, which means that, I can't really slack and, like, simplify it beyond the point of usability, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I've seen, not necessarily in the color domain, but in other domains where people are asking questions to experts. Chances are the question's been asked last week, and stuff gets asked again and again and again. Also, the issue of RTFM, read the fucking manual. Like, you do
Yeah.
the Google search first and then ask the question. All that kind of stuff, which we're all guilty of. Um,
Yeah.
do you
Yeah,
have
definitely some questions are like that.
yeah? Do you have a feeling of what the basic, like? Is there a list that you wish even like, people on the money end of our industry knew? Just like some basic ideas about image capture, image generation. I mean, can you think of the one pager that would
Uh,
damp down all
okay.
those dumb questions?
I think, I think one thing that everyone should know about is the difference between linear encodings and log encodings. I think
Hmm.
linear is very powerful, and everyone who works in VFX would probably agree with this. But this idea of like, if you know the exact relationship of like code value to stops, right? That allows for certain operations in a very convenient way. For example, flare is simply addition in linear. You're taking your image and you're adding on some color, right?
Right.
And then you've got like, oh, exposure is just like stops of difference. You got like this like blur, for example, it behaves in a more plausible way in linear,
Hmm.
right? And because, in real life, it's like if you have like a diffusion filter, right? And your photon like hits it, it's going to be like deflected in one of several directions, but on average, you'll go straight through, in a straight line, right? So that's modeled by some kind of blur kernel, and photons are counted in linear, right? So
Some probability
yeah,
distribution. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah. So so there's linear, and they're like the different implications in terms of like, oh, what happens if you quantize to some number of bits in linear, like if you were to write video files with that, or if you had fused like floating point and whatnot.
Mm.
And whereas like log encodings, for example, you kind of like each one's a little bit different, and you don't necessarily know offhand, like how it feels, but it doesn't necessarily behave the same way. So I think linear, like understanding linear, I think is absolutely critical.
Right.
um Let me think of
Yeah,
another
okay. I
one.
mean,
uh,
while you're thinking about it, one thing I would, just from the colorist point of view, I have always felt that what's lacking is a true linear scope. Like
oh yeah,
I want to see that linear space like,
yeah, yeah.
but
I
very
mean,
hard to visualize because how do you manage it? Oh, I turn it into log. Oh, but then you've lost the benefit of linear.
you could like turn it into log, but then like you just have to mark your axes in terms of like stops of light, for
True,
example,
true. Yeah,
right?
just a scaling thing.
One thing that I've done many times is like I kind of convert to like, I don't want to say HSL, but like one of these like polar spaces, like
Right.
spherical or
Hmm.
cylindrical, right? And then the nice thing about like spherical, for example, is that all possible like saturations are going to be within a certain angle from white.
Yeah.
So that's something that you could draw on a scope and have it like fit on your screen, right? And then whereas like the luminance, like the magnitude of the current color, that is going to be something that's like you probably should take the log base to, and plot it in a waveform or something that way,
Yeah,
right?
and then just scale the
So
axes. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like humans, like we think in terms of like log two, but that doesn't mean that your operations have to take place in log. You know,
Mm.
like there's some operations that are indeed better in log. Like I would call out, the color curves for that, because in linear, all of your control points are going to be squeezed down to the bottom 25%, right?
Yeah.
And that's not very useful. But
I've made a color chart which is the all 30 stops that 16-bit floating point can
mhm,
hold, and it's so interesting when you pop it in, you even if you convert it, just how to those bottom six stops of the
yeah,
of the
you
the
can't
12
touch them.
stops. How can you actually if you try and draw a curve to extract them out, it's just like they're in the nether, like they're in
Yeah,
the dust on the floor. You can't get them back.
yeah, yeah. You need to have some kind of tool that separates those apart
Yeah.
and kind of scales it properly. So like curves, I'll say better in log, but otherwise, I'm a big fan of linear. One other thing that I would recommend people do to
Yeah.
debug their pipeline is I've got this tool on my GitHub, called like gradient smoothness chart,
Right.
and that's something that you should just dump through every operation you have and see like, which of your tools is like creating like some kind of fold. Like so we generate these straight lines, and if you start generating like sharp angles in those lines after whatever operation you used, odds are it's going to end up breaking one of your pictures eventually.
Yeah.
You know. So I wish like people would look at their tools, or they would look at like things that they've developed. They'd look at their pipeline in this view of like, is it smooth or is it not smooth?
Yeah.
The because it seems to me that the reality is that a lot of times we think about like gamut mapping and whatnot, and we're like, oh, was the color like colorimetrically accurate, right? But the reality is that what your brain detects are like these artifacts that like look bad, And if
Hmm.
you can avoid introducing artifacts, then you can like compromise on accuracy for the purpose of like having a very like smooth reproduction that doesn't like look broken, you know?
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll give you a sample, a data point of one, my experience.
Yeah.
So from someone who entered the industry in the mid 90s, then we basically only had lift gamma gain to work with, and we stretched and pulled in the telecine, and we broke the image. By today's standards,
Oh yeah.
we broke and we clipped the image. Um, Nowadays, the understanding of color science is better, the tools are better, everything, the controls better. But I feel that to put it, okay, just to make it sound good, you could say that people grade in a more subtle way now. But I also feel that people ballsy grades are fewer and fewer far between. So maybe that's just the public's taste is interesting. So yeah, I mean, I think color grading's always been this. Sure, you want it done smoothly, you want it done right, you want it done high quality, but at some point, for the creative side, you're actually smashing two things together. You're pulling up and pulling down at the same time, and you're tearing something for an interesting feel. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah, as long as you tear the parts that aren't actually in your current image, it's probably fair game, right? But yeah, like, I mean, I don't know. Like, is it better to have an interesting grade that looks kind of broken, or to have like a subtle grade that's pushed as much as possible, but is still like very, clean, so to speak, right? Like, doesn't have any like anything that you'd look at and be like, that looks gross. Like, I shouldn't be distracted by like weird edges you've accidentally introduced to the background.
Yeah, bubbling grain,
Yeah.
or yeah, that's.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we can explain away a lot to ourselves if we're on board with a story. The defects, the flaws in logic in the story, we just skip over them. If we're rooting for the hero, we think, I love this film, it's the best thing I've ever seen. But like you say, you're probably true that if you were to break down each frame and look, oh, this is actually like noise here, this is pixel, this is noise that the grade actually added that wasn't in the original signal.
Yeah.
So yeah, please give it, as a developer, please give us better and more safer tools.
Yeah, I mean, I like sometimes it could be that the colorist maybe made a mistake or something like that. But other times it's like you wonder like, oh, did the colorist just have this one knob almost, and they like
Yeah.
they like turned that, and then they're like, well, this is as good as this shot is gonna get. And then later, like if they had better tools, maybe they would have been able to execute their creative vision better. So
Probably best signified by saturation. Client
yeah.
says it's too colorful. What do? You pull down the saturation, the master saturation. But actually, it's a set curve. I wanted to reduce this range, but I wanted to increase that range.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
Or like something I think about is like if you have like I buy a lot of movies on Blu-ray, right? And some Blu-rays are better than others, to put it politely, right? And sometimes the compression artifacts, like in some of these, it's pretty bad. Like it's rare. It's probably like 5% or something, or
Well, presumably
like have that kind
the
of
bit
mistake.
rate on Blu-ray is way higher than streaming, I would
You'd
guess.
think, but
Yeah,
there are a couple
maybe not.
where you should not buy it on Blu-ray. Would be my recommendation.
Okay. I,
I'm trying to think. Shutter Island, great fucking movie. I love that movie. The 1080p Blu-ray has horrible grain in it. Like there's something about the compression artifacts. It like the grains like you can see a pattern in like the square kind of thing going on where like every 100 pixels it like looks like it repeats or something. It's so weird. And it's like that's surely not what the colorist intended. But
yeah.
if I don't know, like I think what we need sometimes is like we need to like up our standards in terms of quality control, right? Like we need to be like, oh, that kind of like super like high density red like makes no sense in this shot. We need to be like, oh, that kind of edge in the background like is bad. So that, and then once everyone knows like all these different things to look for, eventually like, people will just like incorporate that into their grade and avoid those mistakes. And then I won't have to like look at, compression artifacts and like terrible
Yeah.
grain.
Or
So
it's naturally built into the way colors mapped, and so that
yeah,
you
yeah, you're like
you
not
don't
even allowed to
naturally
make
you
a
don't
mistake.
naturally slam
Yeah,
everything into the edges of the color space just by doing a basic display
yeah,
transfer.
yeah. That's the dream, at least. Uh, I mean, like with programming, for example, there's like a genre of mistakes where you, how do you put it? Like you have like there are certain programming languages that use very expressive type systems, which means that like you can specify, you make sure you never pass the wrong kind of variable into a certain function. So it like when you like save your code and when you compile it, it will tell you if you've made a mistake on those lines, right? Like you have this guardrail and
Right,
you aren't even allowed to run the code if it has a certain kind of bug in it, you know?
right.
Like like sometimes I think like we need that in color. Like you've got your image and it's like you're like, oh, it's a bunch of code values and I pinky promise it's, log C3 or whatever, right?
Yeah,
And then the tool's like, all right, I heard gamma 24 rec 709, right? And it does its own thing. Like, and you're like, okay, well, You know, if only there's a way that we could like assign like what color space, like what the state of the image is like philosophically to each thing, and make sure that each operation expected that and then returned something reasonable as expected.
Right.
You know?
And a point you raised in a discussion we were having online before is offset. Offset can be a killer. If you've got very low values and you're pumping them below zero just with a bit of subtraction, then there you go. There's going to be like white highlights which turn to black dots.
Yeah, it terrifies me. You know, like there are many operations that, I mean, to be honest, sometimes it's hard to build a tool that takes like a all negative number, right? Like it takes like, you know, something that's like negative 0.1, negative 0.1, negative 0.1 RGB values and does something reasonable with that. You know, like if you're trying to be like, okay, what's the saturation of that color, right? Like, I don't know, right? Like how am I supposed to interpret that in a meaningful way? You know, like
as
if I say like,
to just slamming it off at the
like
bottom.
If I say like, oh, that's black, you know, then, you know, what's negative 0.05, negative 0.05, negative 0.05, right? Like, you know, like you have to do something reasonable in that space somehow, right? And in general, it seems to me that introducing negative values using offset, it's hard to build tools for that, and it's hard to expect that your tools will do something reasonable given those numbers, right?
But isn't it something along the lines of all the pixels that came in are a valid part of the image, unless there's actually a dead pixel or something you didn't want.
Yeah.
So every tool must scale to incorporate everything before it does its work. I mean, that's hard to implement, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like you could think about that, right?
Redefine
like,
zero prior to each operation.
Like you could, okay, so there are a few times when we know that we have an entirely non-negative like state, right? So one is like you did the photography, right? Each photo site has been hit by at least 0 photons. We know that, right? Like no one's ever been hit by a negative number of photons.
Yes.
And from there, you know, your camera maybe log encoded that, or they, you know, let's assume that it just like wrote it to the raw file, right? And then you decode your raw file. And in theory, on certain cameras, on certain pipelines, you'll be able to recover like, you know, for each pixel, you know, what is the estimated color? And at that point in time, you know, your code values are between 0 and whatever the clipping point of the camera is, right? For every pixel, right? Yep. So that's very convenient, you know? I know that if I just do 1D curves all day and I just use gain in linear and I, you know, just do things like that, I'll never actually introduce a negative value, right? Like you're given that guarantee. And the other time is like when you're at the display side, because the display just clips off everything between 0 and 1, like outside of the 0 to 1 range, right? And the thing is, oftentimes as colorists, what we're doing is we're like, oh, I want to grade in AP1, or I want to do DaVinci wide gamut or something like that. And you've shot this camera and your input transform, ultimately some of your colors are super saturated, right? They have 1 or 2 channels are negative numbers, right? Yeah. Usually not very big negative numbers, just small ones, but
because of that input transform, right?
Yeah,
not because of what's going on the sensor. Yeah,
because your input transform has this 3x3 matrix in it that's designed to like make it so that kind of like common colors look reasonable, right? Yeah. And as a result, they've compromised on all the high purity colors. Right. That's what the 3x3 matrix in that thing does. And yeah, like when you're in that scenario, it's like, okay, now you have colors that are like super saturated, so a couple channels are negative. That means if you send those through curves, you're probably gonna have a disaster, you know. And the other aspect is like, okay, you have these colors, but you know, and you know, if you use like a spherical model or something like that, you can like reach outside of like, you know, the cube. You can reach to all possible saturations and like roll those in. You can like compress those in via like a sat v sat curve using one of these kinds of domains, right?
Yeah.
But if someone were then to like, you know, have these super saturated colors and they've just like transformed to DaVinci Intermediate and so on, and then they just offset down, they're like, oh, it's a little too bright. And some pixels are now like below 0. Who knows what to do with that, you know?
Yeah. Well, doesn't it speak to that in a standard color pipeline, there should be certain points where you do this below 0 check. Either it's hard clipping or it's a more elegant solution.
Yeah, there are certain points where, like, you'll have tools that behave acceptably with negative values, and you have tools that don't, right? Like gain, for
Right.
example, it does just as well if you give it a negative number, right?
Mm-hmm.
No problems. And then you have tools that, tools that do not behave properly, right? Like if you want to, if you have some kind of tool that, say it takes the input image and then it tries to apply a noise where the amount of noise is like proportional to the kind of the amount of energy in the frame, right? Given like a negative number, it's like that's not really a meaningful expression of energy, right? Like you really want the input to this tool to be non-negative,
Yeah.
right?
By energy, just to make sure that I understand, by energy you mean linear light input, light
Yeah,
power that was hitting the
yeah,
sensor.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
You want that to
Okay.
be at least zero, in
Right.
general.
With a lens cap on, that's zero.
Yeah, yeah. That should be zero. That's what I aim for when I build an IDT.
Right.
But yeah, like if you have a tool that expects like non-negative numbers, right? Like you kind of want to put those in. You almost want to cluster them together and make sure that you have some operation just before that like
Yeah.
either cuts off everything that's negative or like kind of bends it in so that
Right.
it is non-negative,
Mm.
And that's almost like the workflow that I think like Juan does in with 2499, right? He's got like this idea where you go into 2499 log in which he's kind of done this compression to pull everything in to be non-negative. And then you
Right.
do some operations there and then you go to the display space, right? So
Yeah,
they're
no,
like,
that's a
yeah.
game-changing tool. I really want to talk
Oh,
to him
for
about
sure.
it. Yeah,
Yeah.
stunning.
Yeah, that'll be a great conversation when you guys
Yeah,
do that.
cool.
Um, but yeah. So you kind of have to think of it in terms of like, at what points do I potentially have negative numbers, right? Then at
Mm.
what points do I have to guarantee that I do not, right?
Right.
And kind of look at it that way, I think, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's great advice. I mean, just to swing the conversation around to the coding domain, the world of coding. I mean, this issue of open source and the benefits of open source versus capitalism at large, and what you were speaking, like everyone keeps their tools hidden and it's all encoded DCTLs.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you see the benefits of each of these worlds? The competitive capitalism, everything's for sale and proprietary versus sharing. I guess it's the academic
Yeah.
world, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Academia is,
I told you earlier, like I'm a big fan of the sharing because I think it's often useful if you can be like, oh, this tool I found online is broken. Let me see why, and then like here's a guy, and let's see if he can fix it, or if the author can fix it, or something like that, right? But if the author's not around, they aren't gonna fix it, right?
yeah,
But then there are like a lot of encrypted tools and like DCTLEs, right? And plenty of those are available for sale, and like they still have some value. I'll say like it's not that like I totally hate on that because you can always like send charts through it and you can understand if the tool is good or not. And
right,
sometimes those DCTLEs, you'll look at the charts and you'll be like, this is a really like smooth tool and it's doing things that I visually like and it's very appealing and all of those things, right? And when you see that, then other people building tools are going to be like, I want to make my tool have those properties as well, right? So this kind of stems back to like the quality control thing, right? Like if we all kind of agree or even evolve our perception of like what is good color, right? Then we can then see if each tool produces that or not, right? And
right,
every tool that doesn't, it's like that's a commercial opportunity for someone to make a better tool, either for free or for sale, right?
yeah,
The benefit of doing it like for free is that like you can build it like almost faster. Like if you have like this library of like open tools, it's like people can iterate upon it faster. You can like report bugs and get it fixed or fix it yourself or
But just to
any of
pause
those
there, I
things.
think that's an area that people who don't code themselves probably don't know, is that you can actually use code libraries from other people as the
Yeah.
spanners, screwdrivers, and hammers in your higher level tool. So I mean, I think that's a great level.
Yeah, I mean like truthfully, right? Like, I've written I don't even know how many DCTLs are in my GitHub right now, but it's like when I'm like writing a DCTL for a client, like oftentimes I can just go over to one of the open source ones I did and copy paste some functions or you know, some logic from those, and I can like combine several of them together and, you know, code much faster that way, right? Like if I hadn't like, you know, done that in advance, I would have to be like, I'd have to like almost re-implement stuff from scratch because it's all like secret, you know, in some way. Or it's like, you know, even stuff like converting from like HSL to like RGB, right? Like, you know, I have to Google it and then like read some, you know, Wikipedia article or whatever, and then like
Right.
try to re-implement it from there, right? Like that sucks, you know? It's way better if we all just have the code like available, and
Right.
then you can just
And
like
when
copy and
people are
paste.
paying for your
Yeah.
time to do coding, that's what they're paying for, is the fact that you've done all these sub developments that you can
Yeah,
draw on
I give them
quickly.
a good
Yeah,
deal, you know?
yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, like otherwise I'd have to like have my own private library of code or just build them more so that I could like build it up when needed, right?
Yeah.
And that's not that's not great, you know?
Just a minor detour. I read through the that standard transform from RGB to HSL and back,
Oh yeah.
and for me, that is so amazing. It sounds like this isn't maths. This is a recipe.
Yeah.
You
I
know,
don't
this
know. It's
is
like it's a bunch of
it's
if statements where like we're gonna
exactly
swap the order of these three
yeah.
like terms around, right?
Like
Yeah.
if this channel is higher, then go to this chapter and follow it's like a
Yeah.
choose your own adventure. It's like one of those role playing
Yeah.
books where you if you want to attack, then turn to page 72. If you want to run, turn to page 25.
Yeah. I actually hate that about like HSV and HSL. It's like you've got these like six if statements. It's
Yeah.
basically a piecewise function, you know, like they scale the saturation differently depending on
Okay. Yeah,
which
yeah.
slice you're in, you know?
Right.
It's kind
Okay.
of yeah.
That explains it in a mathematical like piecewise function.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, it's a piecewise function, but like as a result when you do like some kind of adjustment, like you do hue versus hue or you know, kind of like a hue versus sat or something like that, right? Like
Yeah.
you end up with like these kind of it ends up not being very smooth at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, I guess in the
You know?
digital world, you're either on this bit or on that bit, you know, on
Yeah,
this grayscale or
like
that,
it
and
will
you
all connect, you know,
yeah.
but it's like the slope of the curve is,
Yeah,
you
the
know, going to
slope could be
abruptly
different.
change at one point to the next, you know. Sometimes it depends on what operations you're doing, of course, right?
Yeah, the
But like
360-degree hue situation is quite unique.
yeah. Yeah, if you're in like spherical or cylindrical, that's probably the main reasons why I use either of those spaces. It's the transformation is so easy, right? Like all you do is you take like the RGB color, like you have like your cube, and you just rotate the cube so that white is pointing like up, right?
Hmm.
And then you've got like the two perpendicular axes right below, and you
Yeah,
just like you say like, oh, one's like, you know, the x-axis and one's the y-axis, for example, right? And you're like, what angle does the current color make on that axis right now? It's like, okay, that's the hue. Then like, what's the angle that the current color is from the white axis, right? And then that's the saturation, and you're done. Like, you know. So it's like obviously like if you do a hue versus hue adjustment, you could push something outside of the cube, right?
right.
That's the compromise you make. But you have to also only use this model at one of those points in time in your pipeline in which you can acceptably have super saturated negatives. So it's okay because you've like coped in that way, right?
Yeah,
So,
but how many working colorists actually understand half of what you just said?
oh,
That's the
okay.
question. You know,
Yeah.
this is the it's a blessing and a curse.
Yeah.
You know, color science has the easy to use end, the auto, and it's got this end where even the experts kind of think, "Wow, this is amazing. This is a black hole. This is, you know, this is
Yeah.
philosophical."
You know, sometimes you have like a tool that like in principle is cool, but like it doesn't have the right, you know, sliders surfaced. It's hard to control, right?
Yeah,
But yeah, I mean, you know, ultimately it's like you might even identify the best set of operations, right? And then you could just put them in the wrong order and destroy your grades that way, right? Like,
right.
and like being familiar with the technical side allows you to kind of know which operation or like which order of operations you should have, right?
Yeah, I had a screwball idea the other day. I mean, I was teaching someone and I built a pipeline in a typical way. I did my RGB matrix and HSL transforms
Hmm.
first, and then I did my 1D curve second, and then I did my tone split toning third. And I
Okay.
thought, fuck it. What if we do all of these in parallel?
Oh God.
You know, like, why? Why not? So, yeah, and, yeah.
Okay.
It was just a screwball moment, but yeah, it's another way of thinking. Every
Well, that
single one of
did
those
it help?
operations has a nice. No, it's not what I. You definitely can't set it up in serial and then expect it to look the same
Oh
in
yeah, yeah,
parallel.
of course. So it didn't work, or
I didn't take it further, but yeah, I think you basically need to try
you
from
just had the
scratch
idea.
and see what the
Yeah.
limitations are. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm terrified of the parallel mixer. First off, because no one really knows what it does.
Yeah.
But the worst part is that once you do know what it does, it's it feels like it's not appropriate for anything, you know? Oh no. So
So
like just for
the difference between what's coming in and what's coming out of all these branches added to the together, right? Or something like
yeah,
that.
that's pretty much the summary, right?
Yeah.
Like we go like at the parent of all the nodes, you know, prior
Yeah.
to this whole split up, right?
Yeah.
Then we take the difference of each branch with that, and then
Yeah.
we sum those and add those to the parent.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's it's strange. Like I mean, it's funny because like you have operations like blurring, for example, that really
Oh
kind of look
yeah,
terrible
that's
in
to be
parallel.
avoided in a parallel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's like I shouldn't have to just like memorize which operations are bad in parallel. It's better to just understand what parallel is and then be like, oh yeah, that makes sense why that wouldn't work, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Too much freedom. I mean, I'm interested to the you. I see your interaction on especially Cullen's forum, and then I see it's almost like. I mean, you're very active. So, I mean, do you sleep?
Hmm.
That's the first part of the question. And the second part is, what do you benefit from being on these forums, interacting so much? I mean, I mostly just see you helping people. I mean, this is. I think
Yeah.
you're like the ambulance driver.
I mean, you know, sometimes I'm just bored and I'm like, oh, here's an interesting question, you know, and then sometimes I look into it and then sometimes it's like, oh, here's the, you know, here's the answer that you want, like that you'd want to receive, like the technically correct answer that, you know, I don't know if someone else will come up with a similar answer, you know.
Right.
Do I sleep? Well, yeah, I actually sleep quite a bit, but like,
Good.
we just have to
Good.
be in
It's
very different
healthy.
time zones. So
Yeah. Yeah.
you just think I'm up at like 4 a.m. or
Yeah.
whatever,
True.
right?
True.
Like, yeah, but
Literally the other side of the world.
yeah, I do sleep, but you know, so now what do I get out of it? That was the second half of the
Yeah. Yeah.
question.
That's the important part.
Um, shit, I don't know. I kind of enjoy it, you know? Like, I mean, if it's a question like that I haven't answered before, then it feels like it's almost like satisfying to like try to understand like what's the best possible explanation for this and to try to understand some aspect of the science. The idea is that like if someone asks a question where I don't know the answer to it already, then I have to like look it up. I have to like find a good way to explain it. And in the process, I learn something as
Hmm.
well, right? And when I learn something, then that informs what I'm going to be doing on my color grade next, right? So
Right.
like, you know, to be honest, like when I first joined like Cullen's Discord, right? Like I didn't feel like I was that good at the color science stuff and like building these tools and whatnot. I was mostly just good at like profiling cameras and doing this sort of regression thing, right? And you know, over time, it's like you know, sometimes I ask people questions if they have like an interesting operation, or I see like, oh, what's wrong with that, you know, these sorts of things, right? And then there are other times where someone will ask a question and I'm like, oh, I could figure it out, right? Like that's the kind of time when you know that it's good to respond, right? Like if I figure like, oh, someone's asking this and I could figure it out, like okay, I might as well, right? Like
Hmm.
especially if it's interesting, you know.
Well, what's so
So
cool about those forums, it's a bit of like you hear a problem, you have your gut response, I know the answer to that, and you throw it out, and you realize, oh, actually, I don't know.
yeah,
There's a whole lot
ideally,
of other comments that came in. People have actually thought about this in a different way. They've got better or different answers to what I have.
yeah,
So yeah, I mean, that's what's so cool about it. It's open source in action, right?
yeah, in a
Isn't
way,
it?
right? It's
Yeah.
kind of it's almost like the open source thing. Like if someone like I don't know, there's some forums that are much worse, and when someone asks a question, it's like 80% bad answers, and then like
Yeah.
you know a
Avoid.
couple okay ones, right? And you're like, is that more useful? You know? And like ideally, like sometimes you like respond to one of the bad answers, and like the person takes it like very personally or something, you know? Or like that you get into a stupid argument that makes no sense, and I'm like. You know, ideally, you pick a forum that doesn't have those, so then everyone's kind of learning, you know, and
Yeah.
they kind of know when they're right or when they're
Constructive
wrong.
criticism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. If it wasn't like that, I don't know, I bail on those forums pretty fast. I'm in a few Facebook groups that are kind of like that, you
I
know.
stay away. I stay away.
Yeah, it's for the better. Yeah.
I mean, just to like we've spoken quite a bit about your technical interests and the development side, but in terms of your connection to the arts, connection to photography, I mean, what are the genres of film? I mean, do you like everything? Are there particular genres? I mean, what creatively inspires you in the film video world?
Um, the film and video world. I really like. I do watch a lot of movies. I don't really watch too many TV shows, but I do watch quite a few movies, right? And usually I kind of go for like these like thriller movies. Honestly, you know what? Like at the end of the day, the important thing is like the writing,
Right.
in terms of like how good the final product is, right? And you know, as a result, I'm kind of in. I really enjoy the writing. I enjoy like good stories. I kind of watch them like to try to feel something, right? You kind of try to get to the end, and you're like, wow, that was really well done and very emotional, like these sorts of things, right? And then there's also like the technical execution side where you kind of look at it and you're like, could I do that? Well, oftentimes for Hollywood movies, the answer is no.
Yeah.
But but like you kind of look at it and you're like, how did they get these shots, right? Like I find that very curious too, right? Like what was the technical process? Like what kind of set design or props or CGI or other effects did they do? And and then sometimes you see like a color grade that's just like really beautiful or like feels like kind of filmy or rich or something like that, right? And you're like, oh, how do I make something like that? Or what are the qualities of that I like? And even what are the qualities that I don't like, right? And
Mm.
it's all about like ultimately later I get to apply that to my own craft because doing my annual short film, I kind of have my pinky in a little bit of everything, right? So sometimes I like honestly, sometimes I watch the movie just to like look for the editing, right? Like where I'm like, you see like this dialogue scene and you're like, well, when I cut dialogue, oftentimes like someone starts speaking, I cut to them, right? Maybe I'll do a J cut, I'll do an L cut, something like that, right? But sometimes in movies you see like someone starts speaking and they don't even bother cutting to them. It's more focused on the reaction shot of the person who's previously talking, right?
Right.
It's like things like that, and I'm kind of like, that's I love these sorts of decisions and trying to understand like how they're doing that, right? Um,
Yeah, it's some ballsy choice about
yeah,
whose
yeah,
scene
and
is this? What's the important part? Yeah, yeah.
yeah, right. Like, I mean, maybe they just did the cut because like the performance of the other person when they're talking looked bad, but like,
Mm.
but sometimes it's just like it's an interesting decision and you're like kind of curious about it, right? And the idea is like I'm studying all this stuff so that I can apply it to my own shorts at the end of the day. It's kind of the idea, right?
Right.
Um, and I don't know, I end up watching like a lot of like photography and like VFX and color tutorials and stuff like just so that I'm always like kind of learning and evaluating like, does this technique work or is this a good idea or not? And oftentimes it's bad, but sometimes
It
sometimes
needed
you find a real
needed
gem.
checking. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, like there's I like subscribe to this one channel on YouTube. Is this guy who's doing like really good like VFX like videos and he had one about edge extension where he's like, "Oh yeah, if you have like a blurry object and you have to roto it out, like how do you do that, right?" And he has this technique in which you like extend the colors of the edges and then like apply the alpha and whatnot. And I was like, "Oh my God, that's a game changer." I need to
Do you
use
mean
that.
you extend it past the edge of your frame so that you've got clean edges?
No, no, it's like suppose you have something that's like out of focus, right?
Oh,
like
right, yeah.
like my hand here, and it's like
Yeah.
I'm gonna like cut on the inside of my hand, and then I'm
Oh,
gonna
yeah.
extend the skin tones past the edges of
Oh,
my
right, right.
hand,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and then
Okay.
yeah, and then you apply the alpha back in after you like blur it and whatnot. I was like, oh my God, like why didn't I know about this? Like, yeah,
Yeah.
so
But yeah, I mean, it's the curse of working in the film industry and watching films is you always
yeah,
technically analyzing. But I
yeah.
mean,
Now that's the only thing I'm looking at.
I was speaking to students the other day and just trying to sell them on the idea that the correct grade helps with immersion. It's not the
Yeah,
only thing. Obviously, the script, the acting, they're all very important things. The cutting, the dialogue, the acting, all that. But how does the color aid or harm the immersion? I mean, that's an interesting topic.
yeah. I mean, so like it can definitely harm the immersion, right? If shots like are not
Yeah,
matching like consistently,
yeah, matching. Yeah,
like to me that'll take me out of it. To a lesser extent, like there are other ways you can have a bad grade where like you might have some colors that are overcooked or whatever, and I see that I probably I'll say probably most people don't see that. Like most people don't really care.
Yeah.
But but I noticed that.
Or
Um,
graded too hard. Like it's just the grade, but it's like,
yeah.
yeah.
Now, one thing that color can really do though is it can really like improve the production value of the video, right? Like it improves the image quality by like a
Mm.
significant amount because you're like, wow, all of these like it just looks like a really appealing image, right?
It
And
gels. It's meshes together. Yeah.
yeah, and it just looks like something where like you could almost frame it, right? Like it looks like a painting, right? Like it looks great.
Yeah.
And that's something that, I mean, that's probably the main reason I got into, like, I started diving into color grading initially, right? Like, I was like doing my shorts and I was like, okay, what is the current weakest point? And I was like, oh, it's probably the color, right? And then I started kind of like looking at it that way and trying to improve my craft in terms of the color side. At this point, it's probably sound design, to be honest, but
So yeah.
yeah, and
More than
yeah, to me
half.
that yeah, that's so cool.
I've changed. The saying is sound's half the movie. I'm changing. I'm saying I think sound is the immersion.
Yeah,
Sound is what
honestly, the
really
the movie
sinks you
has
in,
to,
and
yeah,
then yeah, pictures are obviously it's flashing pictures. They're kind of signposts which take you from what it is,
yeah,
what the area is, who's speaking, but the sound is what literally sucks you in and drags you and threads the whole thing together.
yeah. Sometimes the benchmark is like you just close your eyes and like, does it still feel good? Like, does the
Mm,
movie still work, right?
yeah.
And some movies they can do. I mean, like it depends on the content, but if you can blur your eyes and it still looks good, like it's that there's something to be said about that.
It's a good
I
job.
like the downside with color though is like at the end of the day, like best case scenario, it almost goes unnoticed. It's like good VFX, right? Like you're just like so sucked into it that you don't even think about it, right? Whereas like there are definitely movies where you get to the end and you're like, I'm buying that soundtrack, right? So clearly the composer of of the music has like some kind of advantage over us, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, music's yeah. I mean, it's probably one of the oldest. If you're going to take writing, drawing pictures, and making sounds, it's probably the oldest
Yeah.
human thing.
Yeah. So I feel like I don't know. I'm like in the middle of editing one of my shorts that's gonna come out in like a month or so, and like it was something where I felt like okay, the editing can take it a really long way, and then I was like the sound takes it an enormous way, and then the music takes it a lot of the way, and then I'm like getting to like color and VFX, and I'm like these are not gonna like move the needle as much as those other steps did.
Right.
But I can't give it a bad color grade, okay? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
so
It's the
yeah,
the way I explain it is you got to make sure that you get at least to the best expectation of the DP. Whatever they manage to shoot and give to you, you're going to take it even better to the finish.
yeah,
You're not
yeah.
going to fuck
That's
it
the
up for
value
them.
add.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you're not going to step on whatever they did.
yeah. Did that answer the question? I forget what the question was. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think so.
all
I
right.
mean the because it's yeah. I mean it's complicated for us because we're so yeah we're interested in the technical as well as but
Yeah,
obviously all of us are drawn to the stories. Um,
yeah. I've
d-
definitely invested a disproportionate amount of time into color, considering like what the ups and bound, like the bounds of how much it can improve the
right.
grade. I mean, obviously, color it can really destroy a movie, I guess, if it's bad enough.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, like a good color looks great. I want my stuff to look good too. I want everyone's projects to look good. I'm down for that. So that's why it's all open source.
Raise the
Yeah,
bar. Yeah, here
yeah,
for
yeah.
that.
Let's raise the bar.
Yeah.
You know.
But what is your? I mean, in the film world, I mean, I guess the Stevie Edlins and various other people are quite anti HDR and all this thing. I mean, do you have any
Oh yeah.
particular take on it? I mean, I guess I see it as two camps. If you're going to simplify it, as two camps. It's either traditional film versus new media,
Hmm.
and the new media group seems to be aligned to technology. So they go for the whatever's I don't want 8K, I want 16K. Whatever's
Yeah.
bigger, faster, better. And the film camp is saying no. I just want film.
Yeah.
I just want what it looks like in a cinema.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Where do you sit on that spectrum?
Well, before I start, let me just say Steve Yedlin, that should be part of the required reading too. Like I'm
Right.
adding him to my response there. Everyone should check out his website. But yeah, on like HDR and like these sorts of like new technologies and whatnot, It's like you go to the movie theater and like if you watch like, recently I saw like Furiosa, like there's like Dune 2 a little bit back and whatnot. It's like when you're watching it, it's like it's 48 nits, but it doesn't feel like, you know, like a dark screen, right? Like on some level, you're like in the theater and you don't like feel like it needs more highlights. It needs your highlights to shoot all the way up and whatnot. Like
Right.
there's definitely a question of like, is HDR even meaningful? Like obviously, yes, when you take HDR and then you instantly switch to an SDR image, you're like, wow, this sucks, right? But like,
Hmm.
but the reality is like a well-mastered HDR image and a well-mastered SDR image, after you wait like 5 or 10 minutes, like they feel the same. Like, you know, like it's almost like meaningless. Like
Yeah, switching back
one,
and forwards
yeah.
is a fool's game. Yeah,
Now
yeah.
HDR, I'll
Mm.
say it has a few benefit. It's more like implementation improvements, right? Like one is that it's like 10-bit, right? Which, to me, you could improve SDR by making it 10-bit. Like 10-bit is great, right?
Hmm.
Over 8-bit. And also it's like it's kind of pushed TV manufacturers to make better monitors, right? Like now the
Right.
black points are darker than ever before. Like for a
Yeah,
thousand dollars you can get a TV with an incredible like contrast ratio, right? Like
yeah.
that
In
that's
SDR
so
too.
dope.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and
Mm.
it's going to be the best SDR monitor you you can buy, right? Like that's incredible, right? So, I appreciate those aspects. I think 4K is really cool. Um, I after watching like Steve's like
Oh,
resolution
res
prep
the yeah,
demo and
yeah.
like I've done some of my tests, I'm like I don't know if it's like meaningful like past like 3K to be honest. I think like like once you go beyond that, like going from 3K to 4K, like, now you can like kind of punch in a little bit. Like honestly, like at 4K, you can like punch in like 130, 140% and no one will notice. Right.
Hmm.
So like from that perspective, I have difficulty believing that anyone should care about like 8K besides like for post flexibility, if you want to call it that. Um,
But yeah, I mean, what the implications it has on your VFX budget if you have to do everything at 4K now. Just fuck it, man. Do it at 2K. Tell the story. Don't worry about the res.
I mean, I,
Yeah.
I like I like 4K. I think 4K looks good, But after a certain point, I started thinking about like the amount of hard drives I need and like, how slow it's gonna be on my computer and the fact that you like no one can really see the difference between 4K and 8K unless you're like really pixel peeping. I mean,
Yeah.
like when was
And
the last time someone?
are you gonna buy an LTO to back it all up afterwards?
Yeah, I don't want to do that. But like when was the last time someone went to the theater and they were like, "That's a 1080p projection. I fucking caught you guys, and I want my refund." Right? Like no one's
Hmm.
ever said that. In fact, most people are sitting too far away to possibly like detect that. I don't know.
Right.
My local theater, when I look at it, their lens must have some kind of chromatic aberration or something, and I see like a green fringe around like the text in the movie.
Right.
I'm like that pisses me off. But like no
But
one's
no,
complaining about that,
what it
right?
should be is that becomes your normal. So you design tools that burn that look.
Oh God.
The
Yeah,
problems
that
of
way you
that
can get the
projected.
theatrical experience at home when you watch my shorts. That's
Exactly.
that's the dream. No, that I look at that and I'm like, you know, that's like a degradation of quality that's probably on par with going from 4K to 1080p. Like it's like a subtle amount, of like this like green fringe, right? It's like, but yeah, at the end of the day, I forget about it after 2 minutes and then I just enjoy the movie, right? Like I'm
Exactly.
never saying like, wow, that looked like some 720p garbage, right? Like, yeah.
I mean, just back to your DCTL library. Do you see that? I mean, with other guys who developing these range of tools, they have a hue tool, a sat tool, or this tool, or that tool. And it's almost like, hey, these are great tools. Couldn't they be turned into a whole color corrector? Just naturally we think in these lines. I mean, do you see your tool set, or how do you see it developing over the years? Do you see it growing into something bigger, or just always being just
A bunch of small
literally,
tools.
yeah, yeah,
Well, well, kind of like having a bunch of small tools has its benefits, right? So it means that if you want to do something different, you can often just change the order of your existing tools,
right,
right? It means that if you want to copy certain adjustments from one clip to the next, you know, you don't have to like have 30 sliders and then be like, oh, I only wanted to copy 5 of them, right? You just copy like the one node.
yeah,
So there's certain benefits there, right?
yeah, modular, excellent.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think having control over the order of operations, I think is pretty huge. Now, admittedly, I don't know how many of my users know what order of operations they should use, but at least they can choose, right?
Right.
Um, and I might not necessarily prescribe the universally correct one, right? But yeah, like should we turn it all into one tool? There's also another downside if you're to do that, right? One downside if is that like with DCTLs you can't really choose sort of like how all this like you don't have full control over the ordering of your sliders and checkboxes and whatnot, right? Like the
Right.
sliders will always come first, and then
Yeah.
like checkboxes and like the drop downs are going to be at the end, right? So it's like if you were to combine these tools together, just practically speaking, you would end up with this like mashup ordering
All right.
that
Right.
would
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
suboptimal. Now, if I switch to OpenFX, I don't think that has that limitation. It's my understanding.
Is
But
it a lot harder to write an OFX? I mean,
oh yeah,
is
writing a
that a
DCTL is super easy. Honestly,
yeah?
like I enjoy writing DCTLs because it kind of feels like I can sit down and then an hour later it's done.
It's done. Eh?
And yeah, I don't necessarily have that with every framework. I think
Right.
OFX. First off, I don't really know how to write them, but like, I'm probably gonna try to learn to write those by the end of the year. I think,
Yeah.
but yeah, it seems like
Have
there's a
you
lot
had
more
any
overhead.
exposure to the Python library? I mean, is that like yet another level up?
Yeah, I mean, I code Python professionally, so like,
Oh, okay.
yeah, so,
That's
so I've
walk
definitely
in the
like played with
park.
the Python thing, but it doesn't plug into Resolve easily, right? Like you can't take images out of Resolve, manipulate them in Python, and then dump them back in, right? So that's kind of a big pitfall, I would say, right? I mean, maybe I should do what Yedlin does, just color grade everything in Nuke. That seems to be a reasonable,
Yeah.
solution, I guess. I don't know, but yeah, like Python's pretty good. Like there are certain things that you can't do in a DCTL, and right now what I end up doing is I reach for Python just to experiment with it, and then yeah, and then that's kind of what it ends up being. It's like, oh, this was a good idea or this was a bad idea. And sometimes I use Python just to like test certain logic. Like I have this interesting tool called rebind LGGO, where it takes your lift gamma gain and offset wheels and you can bind them to other things. Um,
For what
and
function? What would be the purpose of
yeah, so
that?
you could rebind offset to be linear gain. Um,
Oh, I see. Okay.
yeah, and then
Like
when you've got your
remapping.
printer lights hotkeys in Resolve, you can like just directly adjust linear gain. I've got one where like there's one option where when you mess with the gain wheel, it only ever like lowers one of the three channels below 1.0, right? Like it never actually pushes any of them to be brighter. So then it feels like you move the gain wheel around and the image kind of maintains its value, we could say.
Oh, right. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Excellent. Yeah.
I've got one where if you mess with the gamma wheel, it can keep mid gray fixed at like 0.18 and then adjust the contrast around that so it's got like a different pivot point.
Yeah.
So there's some functionality in
Zero
there along those lines.
sum
Yeah.
color offsets.
Yeah, I've
That's
got one
cool.
where
Yeah.
you just rebind lift to offset because I never use lift. So um yeah,
Or
well
contrast increases and saturation
yeah.
simultaneously
Yeah, so,
decreases.
so there's this enormous challenge in writing that tool, just to give an example, where it turns out so basically I needed to capture what each of the wheels is doing based off of how it manipulates like these pixels that were in the corner of the frame, right? So we'd inject the pixels, you do lift gamma gain, and then we read those pixel values and figure out what values you entered for lift gamma and gain, right?
Right.
And it turns out gamma is the last of those operations. And that makes it actually incredibly difficult to identify what value of gamma was used. So I wrote a Python script to make sure that I could do this, but the Python script would it like it did a search to find which value of gamma was the most likely option, right? And then I used that to like prototype, and I was like, okay, I can get the search to expire in like to terminate in like 30 iterations or something, which is fast enough for a DCTL to run in real time. And then like I implemented it again in the DCTL, and now it's like it pretty much ended up working. But it's such a hack, you know. But it's like
Yeah.
sometimes Python can like assist your coding in a way, right? Or oh yeah, here's a better example, right? So sometimes I use Python like I think of like some kind of spline that I need, like maybe I'm like it has to go through this point, and when
Right.
the x value is some other thing, it should have this slope, right?
Right.
Like so you could do that with a quadratic function, right? But then
Mm-hmm.
you have to figure out what the weights are, like ax squared plus b. X plus C, right? So you have to find out what A, B, and C are, right? And there's a closed form solution for that, but I don't want to find it by hand. So you can use Python to there's a library called SymPy or something, and it's like an equation solver that where you like tell it all the constraints, and then you're like, all right, now solve algebraically for A, B, and C, right? And then I can just paste that into my DCTL, and now I have
Like
my spline,
fit a curve
right?
to these requirements.
Yeah,
Yeah,
pretty
that's
much.
very
And it gives
powerful.
you like the closed form solution, right? So then like now I can drive those with a slider or whatever, and then it recomputes A, B, and C, right? And it does the right thing. But I had Python figure out the algebra for me so that I wouldn't have to do that myself. So
Yeah,
yeah, I do like
brilliant.
yeah, it's Python's great, you know. Highly recommend. Very fast to code in too. So
Yeah, I know you've done DCTL kind of guides for people, but I mean, is there any in your, you've experimented with lots of areas. I mean, would you give, what are your main tips for someone who wanted to start this road? Because I think I'm also, when I do teaching, I really, I kind of push people to say, if they have any mathematical, scientific interests, try and push that into DCTL. So what advice would you
oh yeah.
give to people who are starting to
You
help
know,
them get
so
over that initial difficulty?
yeah, I mean like I felt like coding DCTLs has really helped me understand things, right? Because it's like, you know, if you're talking about like a color space transform, for example, right? Like people say, okay, you have to like linearize and then you like apply a matrix and then you go back to log or something like that, right?
Mm,
And then it's like to actually like implement that, like each of those steps, you have to find out like, oh, what is the log function that I used in this source? What was the log function used at the destination? And then you're like, how do I even compute the matrix that that goes from one set of primaries to the other, right? And then when you
right,
go down that rabbit hole and you actually have to like figure it out, and you don't just get like some explanation, like someone will just say like, oh yeah, you just compute the, you know, just based on the primaries, you know, you compute it, right? But it's like, how exactly do you do it? When do you add the chromatic adaptation and whatnot? Right?
order of
Like,
operations and
yeah,
all
you end
that.
up
Yeah,
like really like going in, and then you find someone online for this specific thing. I would recommend Bruce Lindblom's site. He has a good mathematical explanation of how to do all of those operations, and yeah, like you kind of just like, and then like you implement it based off of that, and then once you get to the end, you're like, oh, now I actually understand how it works. Like you know every single step along the way, right? And you know, there's some parts of that process in which like some of those formulas are a little obtuse, like you know, it's hard to understand. But at least like you know now you can like copy and paste the code elsewhere, and you know the sense like ultimately like you know it's a combination of like three matrices, but like you know like in total it's a matrix, right? And
right.
you really understand the kind of the backbone of this operation, and yeah, then other times you're like, oh, let me make some kind of like sat v sat curve, and you have to like figure out splines. You have to like figure out what model you're gonna pick for it, and the you know as a side effect, you'll figure out pros and cons because you know if you picked HSL or something, you're probably gonna have some smoothness issues here and there. Or maybe it doesn't generalize well the outside of the cube or things like that, right? And
Right,
like
at
these
the
are like little
extremes.
aspects that you kind of learn. Like you almost have to learn it by doing, which you know kind of sucks to say, but I to me that helped a lot, right? Like whenever
Yeah, you're
there's some
seeing
tool
under
that you
the
think is
hood.
missing,
You're
you try
seeing
to
under
do
the
it.
hood, behind the
Yeah.
curtain, what's going on.
Yeah. Or, you know, and I've done this too many times, right? Like if I'm really stumped on something, I'll try to find an open source version of it online and see what someone else did, right? And maybe they did something good, maybe they didn't, you know. It's unclear, right? Like when you read it, you have to kind of make that judgment yourself. Or you can implement it and then find out if it was good or bad, right? Um, you know, one example of that is like you know, I've been thinking about highlight reconstruction sometimes. So I looked at
Hmm.
like Darktable, for example, is open source project, right? And you can just kind of see how they did it. Really smart guy behind it too. Turns out you can't really like convert that to a DCTL easily, but you know,
Does it need a buffer or something like that?
yeah, like oftentimes like you say like oh there's like this clipped region of the frame, and you'll like go to the borders of it, right? And then you
Right,
have to like propagate inwards from there, and that's
right.
like that's kind of tricky, right?
Yeah, that's a spatial. You'd need a frame buffer
Yeah,
and something. Yeah.
yeah,
Huh.
yeah. You need some kind of buffer ideally, or you know, the other thing that I've often done, I highly recommend doing this, is if there's some kind of operation that you're confused about, like say correcting for lens distortion or like chromatic aberration, or you want to do like film grain or something like that, what you do is you can search on like Google Scholar for articles about it, and you can see what people in like academia have done in order to approach it. Now, I'll admit a lot of them have like flaws in their methodology, like they're working entirely display referred or something like that, right? And nowadays, they probably used AI somewhere in the in the process, which doesn't really teach you anything. But that's always useful too. And sometimes those papers even have code linked, that you can like take a look at and you know figure out any details that were missing from the original paper.
Yeah, I mean that's the amazing thing about
Yeah.
the era that we're in is that we just flooded in resources. It's almost there's not enough time to to read it all.
Yeah.
Compared to the old days where we had the Telecine Internet Forum, the TIG, which was an email
Yeah.
forum, and yeah, you could glean a bit from that, but not much.
Yeah, I mean, like what I said with like machine learning was that whenever I was doing a project in that space, I would read like, the top 5 papers on the topic, and then I'd try to implement something from there, right? And you can almost do the same thing with color, right? Like if you're wondering how to implement something, or you're wondering how something works or how it should be tackled, you could look up papers, or you could look up code for it and then see how other people did it, or you could watch YouTube or whatever, right?
Hmm.
And as long as you can assess whether each implementation was good or bad, and usually people tell you why their implementation's the best, so you can
Yeah,
that gives you a hint, right?
got to do some filtering.
Yeah, you have to filter with your brain. Don't stop doing that, right? But yeah, as long as you can definitely do like research now and figure out what approach works and what doesn't.
Yeah, and do what you do, which is test, shoot your own stuff, see how it works.
Yeah, practical tests are useful too. They can be boring sometimes, I'll say, but
Yeah, it's its own type of
yeah,
rigor. You realize,
yeah,
okay, I'm standing in a different place every time, hence I'm reflecting light onto the subject, hence,
yeah.
da, da, da,
If you have
whatever.
a strong like mathematical understanding of things, you can often filter out the bad ideas as early as possible, you know.
Right.
And the other thing I recommend is like you kind of do like a mock-up, or like a minimum viable product, you could call it. Like you do a very low fidelity prototype, and you see if it works there or not, and that helps you kind of cull that idea before you waste too much time on it. You know.
I mean, on that idea, when you code things up, do you take the idea of do you explain it in levels, like higher level language? Explain it in English first, then get it into maths, then get it into code. Then do you take that approach kind of quite rigorously, or is it more organic?
Uh, like DCTLs, like I said, most of them are like 1 or 2 hour problems.
Right.
As
So you can
it
kind of
as it
jump
ends up being,
ahead. Yeah.
like I guess, yeah. So I kind of like, I'll drive to work like a few times, and I'll think about it, and then
Right.
eventually I feel like pretty clear about how it would work, and like what are the empty parts, and then like I will start implementation, and like implementation usually I hop in, and then I say like, what are the functions that I need to implement in order for this thing to work, right? And I'll like kind of outline those, and then I'll fill in like each one pretty much. And
Blocks. Yeah. Yeah.
ideally, you should test it along the way, but sometimes I don't do that because I'm optimistic that it'll work on the first
Yeah.
try. When it doesn't work, that's a very frustrating approach. Like,
Yeah.
but when it does work, you're like, wow, I saved time. That's great.
Go back, start again. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of a maybe a do as I say and not as I do kind of thing. But
Right.
I do recommend, if you test as you code, you have much better odds of not being pissed off by the end of the process. Yeah.
Right. But yeah, I mean, it's like asking a musician to formalize the way they get inspired to write a song. It's like, makes it dry, makes it boring. So
Yeah.
yeah, presumably there's that kind of
There's a challenge that if you spend too much time
passion
thinking
to
about
it.
it, eventually you get bored of the task, and you don't get around to actually making it.
Right.
So you don't want to make that mistake. But yeah, definitely, like oftentimes, like, I'm sitting in these discords, and someone's like, oh, here's a video in which Steve Yedlin did this or whatever, right? And then you're like, I wonder if I could implement something like that, right? So one example would be like Yedlin, in one of his webinars or whatever, he was talking about like a tool that would like blur the edges of the frame, like kind of like anamorphic lenses do,
Yeah.
if they have like a heavy field curvature.
Hmm.
And I was like, that doesn't seem like that hard to make, you know, and I didn't really know how to re-implement that in Resolve. You can actually use the tilt shift tool to do it, but if you didn't know that, like me, then then I went ahead and like kind of coded it up, and I was thinking like there's certain aspects of that look that I really liked, where sometimes at the bottom you have like really wide ovals, and then on the sides you have like tall ovals and stuff like
Yeah.
that. And I'm like, that looks cool. Like, can I make it so that my tool does something along those lines?
Because
That's the idea.
it's propagating out in like spokes from the center of the circular lens,
Yeah, you
right?
start at the
Yeah, yeah,
center, and then
yeah.
like your blur kernel increases in size. And not only
Hmm.
that, you can actually change the shape of your blur kernel as you move, right?
Right.
And yeah, that's kind of the main challenge, is figuring out like, oh, if I'm at this pixel, and you set those parameters, what should be the shape of the blur kernel so that I get the cat's eye effect that I want?
Right, right. You've got a
Yeah,
master picture in
yeah,
mind, which is, I think that for me, that's the hardest. I don't write DCTLs, but just thinking about how it should be implemented, having this master picture in mind, which you can't
yeah,
store in a buffer, that the code's got to do pixel by pixel, line by line, and you've still got to
yeah.
obey this master structure or
Yeah,
circular,
yeah, that can
whatever.
be challenging.
Yeah, yeah.
That one, like, I was like, in order to fully do this tool, I need to make another tool first, which was like a chart that had like the grid, and then I also had a chart that put like dots on a regular basis. And then what I could do afterwards was, I could like test it out and see if there are aliasing problems, which there ultimately were. But the best part was that I could shoot. I pulled out my camera, and I pointed it at the grid with just the dots, and I like,
On your screen, yeah.
yeah, just on my
Yeah.
screen, and then I pulled the focus on the camera to like infinity or whatever, and then I could see like how the cat's eye looked and how it like added up, when they were too close to each other, and how the cat's eye looked compared to when it was in focus, right? And you could see sometimes the cat's eye, it's not centered on the same point as the underlying dot, like there's some interesting findings there, you know.
Cool. I
So
can't remember. We were talking about something earlier. I think it was your camera profiling. But what I
yeah,
think is, it's great. It seems like a great, I call it outlet or like sideline thing, is that you can take your ideas and you can test them in the real world. If it's
yeah,
purely a coding issue and it's all in the digital world, it might feel a bit constrained. But you can jump out and say, okay, let's get some lights. Let's get a test color
yeah,
chart, and you can get into analog, the real world, and see.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I've got some equipment to do that. I've got like a handful of film cameras. I've got lights. I've got too many lenses. I've got digital cameras too. So I can more or less try everything, and see if it works, right?
Yeah.
And that's always that's a good
Yeah,
time for
I
sure.
love testing. It's such an education
Yeah.
process.
Yeah, there's definitely a pitfall you can fall into where you're like, well, this should work in theory, but if you don't have a real world reference, sometimes it's hard to test your claim,
Right.
without real testing, right?
Yeah. I mean, I recently on Cullen's forum, I've heard people with a lot of experience talking about that the essentially the theories, the underlying
Or
elements
like
that we
color
rely on
perception.
in color management are
Yeah.
actually they false assumptions, or they flawed assumptions, and they're not accurate. I mean, how do you feel that the simplicity which we would underlies it is enough, or do you think that we need to go back and rewrite the basics?
Yeah,
Is
I mean,
1931 as colorimetry assumptions good enough?
well, I mean, like there's some parts that are okay and there's some parts that aren't. Like it depends on what the specific task is, right? Like one thing you have to like keep in mind with most of these tests that involve like color appearance models,
Hmm.
it's like it's like when you read the paper in which they introduce one of these models, right? They more or less have a similar format. Step one is they figure out like, okay, here's like some downside of the existing color appearance models, and they all have horrific downsides for the reasons we'll soon see. And then step two is they're like, okay, we built some like monitor or setup in which we show like one little color here and maybe another color there. And, maybe we mix between them, like we strobe between them or something like that. And then you modify one of the colors to be as close to the other one as possible. Or you ask people like, here are two colors that are next to each other. How different are they? Like are these two more different than those two? Like things
Right.
like that, right? And then, you have like 8 people look at it, right? It's always a small number, but that's actually not my, people like to latch onto that, but that's actually not my biggest criticism.
The data
And
set,
then,
yeah, yeah. Mm.
yeah, I don't really care that it's only 8 people. Like, it's probably not that bad. But like the bigger problems are the rest of the methodology. And then what you do is you've ultimately like got this set of samples of like, 8 people reviewed, I don't know, a few hundred colors each, right? Maybe more. It's very time consuming. And then you're like, okay, I'm going to construct a series of polynomials that fit all the data and they fit all the previous data at the same time. And then you're like, okay, now we fit all the data better than everyone else. And
Right.
it's like, okay, first off, you're like, on some level, you're evaluating on the set that you like fit your polynomials to, right? So, you can fit polynomials to any data set, right? Like,
Yeah.
and it'll do well. The other thing is like, how do you know, like, how does it
So I
perform
mean,
outside of the scope of your data set,
just to pause for a
right?
sec there. Sorry. You're saying it's statistical gymnastics, mathematical gymnastics.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily proving that the underlying test was good or valid or
Yeah,
thorough
to
or
me, it feels like mathematical gymnastics, right? Like
Mm.
you're like you fit a model to the data that you like measured, right? You
Hmm.
evaluate it on similar data or the same data,
Yeah.
right? And then now, like, how does it perform like outside of that scope, right? How does it perform on more pure colors, like beyond that? How does it perform on like real world images or like any scenario where you're not just measuring two colors that are right next to each other, like
Yeah.
comparing
The
two paint chips,
two
right?
degree angle or whatever. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Mm.
right. Like these are like serious issues, you know? And then like, at the end of the day, it's like you take any model like that and then you're like, okay, here I've made my color appearance model and I'm going to take like, some picture and for each pixel, I'll convert it into the color appearance model space. Then I'll do some manipulation and then I'll convert it back to like RGB values and send those to the monitor, right? Like that's your plan. But
Yeah.
it's like when you're doing that, it's like each pixel needs to be understood in the context of its neighbors, right? Everyone's seen all those optical illusions where it's like you have these
Right.
two gray patches that are the same gray, but it's
Hmm.
like one looks darker, right? When you're doing this, like what's essentially a LUT, right? Like when you're in the space of that color appearance model, it has no idea that these two grays are actually like they look different to you. Like it doesn't even make a good prediction there.
Yeah.
Like that's outrageous, right? Like you've spent all this time like collecting data and fitting these polynomials. Who knows how well the polynomial performs outside of the gamut, like the training data set. And then finally, we just know it doesn't perform well on any optical illusion in terms of making predictions. So it's just
Right.
it's just kind of garbage, right? Like it's like you could maybe argue that optical illusions are like obviously it's out of scope because it's like you fitted it
Edge
for this
case.
task of
Mm.
comparing two colors that are like adjacent to each other or
Hmm.
like flickering between them or something like that, right? But it's like, that shouldn't give you confidence in the model, right?
Right.
Like,
It's a very the case was too specific. Yeah.
yeah, it feels like you're generating a model for a very limited use case. And then you're like, like obviously it's not going to perform well in other use cases, right?
Well, it's the same with film profiling. If you where you put your patches is where your data will be rich. And if you
Yes.
either if you put it
Yeah.
like if you have all your clumped around skin tone, then you'll get some very good skin tone reproductions. But
Yeah.
neon traffic lights and all these other things will be bad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
particularly if you don't have any patches around the traffic lights and whatnot, right? Like if you only
Right.
like shot like the color checker SG under like 6 exposures, and
Yeah.
then you're like, okay, I made my film profile. Like there's really no guarantee that your profile will look anything like film for colors that are outside of that scope, right?
Well, yeah, just hoping that the curve that the trajectory that your
Yeah,
curve is shooting off at into infinity is the right trajectory that somehow will
pretty much.
encompass those.
I mean, so it depends. Like on the topic of film profiling, I think there are multiple approaches, right? Like, so if your approach is like, I'm going to interpolate between these colors that I measured, right? Then obviously you need to have made sure that you measured colors that cover every imaginable color that you're ever going to run into, right?
Right.
Now, alternatively, if your approach is like, I've somehow designed a physical like emulation of like all the different aspects of film, like grain and like the dyes and all that, and you've like figured that out, you know, then potentially with very few curves you could capture the entire character of film, right? Maybe.
Right. So from the film
So
itself rather than
yeah,
the
it depends.
subject. Yeah.
Like it depends how close to like, you know, the bare metal, right? Like your process is, right?
Which part you saying is a black box? You know, like
Yeah.
okay, I'm saying inputs to what I get back once I see it on a monitor. That's you taking the whole internal, the film processing, the film lab, all of that's a black box. Versus,
Yeah.
oh, I'm going to dive into
Yeah.
that stage.
If
Yeah.
you think it's all a black box, then you know, and you're gonna end up using one of these approaches where you're like, I got a bunch of samples, and then I dump it into the black box, and I see what comes out, and then I'm gonna interpolate between those, or I'm gonna fit a neural network to it to, you know, which is ultimately the same thing, you know,
Right.
on some level, right? Um, Whereas if you have like some idea of like the underlying mechanics, then potentially you can do a much better job, right? Like, so imagine like, I guess here's a really like simple example. Like, imagine you're given a picture that's like, I don't know, Arri log C3, right?
Hmm.
And you're given two samples of it. Like your black box is just a one-stop exposure increase, right?
Right.
And then if you're sitting there and you're like, I need to fit this with interpolation, what you're going to do is you're going to draw a 1D curve. And you're going to like try to match the exposure increase, you know, in the curves panel. Or if you're smarter, right, you would convert to linear and you'd apply 2x gain and you'd be done, right?
Right.
Like,
Each step.
yeah, like so if you have like the right understanding, potentially the number of parameters you need drops enormously, right? Like 2x gain, that's one parameter. It's the number 2, right? But if you're drawing the 1D curve, you're going to have a lot of control points to really capture the behavior and the shadows correctly, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah, if
it
that makes
becomes
sense.
very, especially as you approach the noise floor.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay. So yeah, I mean, just to throw the net really wide. I mean, are there any areas that are currently like your obsession or the rabbit hole that you most keen to dive in now? Because I know that you know there's psychophysics, there's just the underlying physics and maths. We spoke
Yeah.
a bit about color models. I mean, what is the bleeding edge for you
Yeah, I mean,
currently?
there's some interesting research in terms of like models that kind of make these better predictions on like on optical illusions and whatnot. So if you know Troy, like Troy's
Yeah.
working on some of that stuff, and you know I chat with him about it sometimes. And you know it comes a lot from like Retinex theory, which is it's quite interesting. It's about how like you know things diffuse across edges and like you kind of you kind of like take each edge separately and make a judgment about what's between the edges based off of the edges around it,
Right.
which I think is probably more realistic in terms of you know characterizing what you perceive in
And
optical
specifically
illusions.
what the brain is doing, because we've
Yeah,
got parts of the brain that detect edges, parts of the
yeah,
brain that et
yeah, and it's
cetera, et cetera.
motivated
Yeah.
by the biology, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
so I find that interesting. I wish I put more work into that. I also find film emulation interesting too. So that's something that I want to do well. You know, like eventually I'll come up with a good model for it. Um, I think it can be done. You know, it can be done, but we'll work in progress. We'll say.
Well, you
Uh,
seem very well poised. You've got this interest in film all the way up to the creative stuff, writing and making your own films.
yeah,
You've got this machine learning, which yeah, I mean, ultimately it's a data problem. You know, we've
yeah,
spoken about the sample point
absolutely.
problem and all this thing.
Yeah,
But yeah, your background in machine
yeah.
learning
That
and all that,
sort of the machine
that's
learning and data science thing is actually crazy good primer for for everything related to color. Because like
right.
if we're being honest, for the most part, color does not require that difficult math. You know, like
Yeah.
it's mostly like you know linear algebra, a little bit of like some curves people make up, and
Hmm.
like a little bit of calculus maybe. You know, like
Right.
it's really not that bad. And machine learning, it's kind of like a similar sort of scope, but it kind of gives you this idea of like what is a good experiment, what is a bad experiment, and like what would make a good input data set for these things. And that kind of gave me a different perspective, I think, than maybe what other people have had. Um, yeah, other deep dives. There's one project that I wish people would do well would be like something to kind of do a good job of auto color grading, like kind of like colorlab.ai, just balancing a lot of
Raise my
shots
hand
before.
as a skeptic, yeah?
I mean, like it'd be hard, but I think
Yeah.
in principle, a machine learning model should be able to like take a reference still that you've graded and then try to at least balance the other shots to match it
Right.
via the operations that you've recommended.
Signal weight, or say, yeah.
Yeah, there's got to be a good way for that. So I've thought about that sometimes, but I haven't really moved on that one too much. I don't know. They're like a few. It's a few small things like here and there. I think the film one is most entertaining for me mentally.
Right.
Other rabbit holes.
Links closest back to your passion, I guess.
Yeah. I think I really like what Juan has done on 2499. So I have to like read through his code more thoroughly. I've read through it a couple times with half understanding, and
Yeah.
and I have to I want to understand how exactly it works because it gives pretty good results, and I'd be excited
stunning
to see
results.
what the next thing is going to be. There's I think Richard Feynman said something about like, if you want to make the next state of the art thing, you have to like read all the research and then up to the point that you could have made the last state of the art thing, and then go from there, right? So I think that tool's top tier. So like, I got to understand it fully. I don't know. There are like a few things where I have to dive into it still, but I don't know if I'm really deep on anything right now. Actually, yeah, I've kind of been all in on my work on my short for the last couple months.
Great.
Yeah.
All power to you. So yeah, I've taken up a lot of your time. So I just wanted to say thanks a lot, and you've given many insights. And I hope to chat to you again in the future. I think this has been a wonderful tour through. Yeah, I mean, a very technical machine learning side, your interest in film, and the industry in general. And I hope to chat to you regularly on the forums.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Thatcher. Keep well. Thanks again for listening to the Color Mentor podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. You can leave comments on Patreon or Instagram. The Instagram handle is color.mentor. And remember to head over to the Color Mentor page on patreon.com and check out the goodies there. We'll see you next time.